The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Dr. Walsh couldn't bring himself to leave his desk. The data streaming across his screen showed what humanity had feared for decades. They were no longer alone, and their visitors weren't friendly outside. His lab window at the Global Defense Initiative, he could see people going about their normal lives, completely unaware that everything was about to change. The first ships appeared 3 days ago, massive geometric forms that blotted out stars and cast shadows on the moon. No warning, no gradual approach, just sudden arrival with the kind of technology that made Earth's best spacecraft look like paper airplanes. The world's governments had been in emergency session ever since, while scientists like Walsh worked around the clock to understand what they were dealing with. Admiral Thane felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as he walked through Luna Station's command center. Every screen showed the alien fleet hanging in space like dark angels of judgment. His communication teams had tried every frequency, every protocol, every mathematical sequence they could think of. The response had come 12 hours ago, a transmission so clear and perfectly translated that it made Earth's finest linguists weep with frustration at their own limitations. The message was simple. Surrender or die. High Chancellor Krex stood before the vast viewing portal of his flagship, watching the small blue world turn slowly in the darkness. His species, the Valdori, had conquered 47 worlds in the past 2 centuries. Each one had followed the same pattern: initial resistance, demonstration of superior power, then inevitable submission. The primitive inhabitants would realize the futility of fighting the galactic dominion and accept their new place as vassals. This world would be no different. The intelligence report showed a species barely capable of interplanetary travel, still dependent on chemical rockets and primitive energy sources. They had discovered faster-than-light communication, but hadn't yet mastered the technology themselves. Their weapons were crude kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. The conquest would take perhaps a week, maybe less. Commander Rivera couldn't sleep, so she found herself walking the corridors of the orbital defense platform humanity had built in secret over the past 20 years. The project had started after the Roswell incident revealed that Earth wasn't as isolated as people believed. Every major nation had contributed resources, scientists, and personnel to build defenses against a threat that might never come. Now that threat hung in space above them, and Rivera wondered if all their preparation would matter. The platform looked like a communications array from the outside, bristling with what appeared to be sensor equipment and research instruments. In reality, it housed the most advanced weapons humanity had ever built, based on technology reverse-engineered from that crashed ship in New Mexico. The railguns could accelerate projectiles to significant fractions of light speed. The particle beams could slice through known materials like hot knives through butter, but would any of it work against alien technology? President Harrison had aged 10 years and 3 days. The weight of representing all humanity in first contact negotiations was something no leader in history had faced. The alien transmission had been broadcast simultaneously to every government, every military installation, and every major population center on Earth. There was no hiding this. No time for careful preparation or diplomatic protocols. The ultimatum was clear: submit to Dominion rule and become a vassal species, or face complete annihilation. 72 hours to decide the fate of 8 billion people and all human civilization. The Security Council had been in continuous session, but Harrison already knew what Earth's answer would be. Humanity had never been good at submission. General Brooks reviewed the deployment reports streaming in from every continent. Military forces worldwide had mobilized with unprecedented cooperation. Ancient enemies were sharing technology and coordinating strategies. Nuclear powers were offering their arsenals not as threats against each other, but as contributions to humanity's common defense. For the first time in recorded history, the entire species was truly united against an external threat. The preparations were impressive but probably inadequate. Satellites showed the alien fleet possessed weapons that could crack continents and shields that shimmered with unknown energies. Their ships moved without visible propulsion, maneuvered in ways that defied physics as humans understood it, and communicated across impossible distances instantaneously. Everything humanity had built seemed primitive by comparison. Captain Torres ran final checks on the Defiance, humanity's first combat spacecraft designed specifically to fight alien technology. Built in the orbital shipyards hidden behind the Moon, it incorporated every breakthrough the secret defense programs had achieved. The hull used metamaterials that could distribute energy impacts. The weapons combined human innovation with alien principles. The crew had trained for scenarios they hoped would never occur. Now those scenarios were reality. The ship's artificial intelligence, based on quantum computing principles discovered in the alien wreckage, provided tactical analysis that painted a grim picture. The enemy fleet outgunned Earth's defenses by orders of magnitude. But Torres had studied every human conflict in history, and he knew that superior firepower didn't always determine victory. Sometimes the desperate and clever could overcome the mighty and overconfident. Dr. Walsh finally left his lab as the deadline approached. The streets were strangely quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath. People gathered around screens, in shop windows, watching news reports that struggled to explain the impossible. Some prayed, others protested. Many simply waited to see what their leaders would decide. The decision came at exactly 71 hours and 59 minutes after the ultimatum's delivery. President Harrison's broadcast reached every human. Settlement from the Antarctic research stations to the International Space Station. His words were simple, translated into every language, and transmitted directly to the alien fleet on all frequencies. We are humanity. We have received your ultimatum and considered our response carefully. We choose to fight. High Chancellor Krex received the transmission with something approaching amusement. These creatures actually believed they could resist the Galactic Dominion. Their response showed the same primitive defiance he had seen countless times before. It would make the eventual submission more satisfying and serve as an excellent example to other potential rebels throughout Dominion space that he gave the order for preliminary bombardment, expecting the humans to reconsider once they witnessed Dominion power firsthand. The demonstration would target military installations and population centers, causing enough damage to break their spirit without destroying valuable infrastructure. It was a proven formula that had worked on every world the Dominion had ever conquered. What High Chancellor Krex didn't know was that humanity had spent 70 years preparing for this moment, ever since that first crashed ship had revealed they weren't alone in the universe. The preparations went far beyond weapons and defenses. Humanity had studied every aspect of the alien technology they could recover, learned to think like a spacefaring civilization, and most importantly, they had united as a species for the first time in their history. The war was about to begin, and both sides were about to discover that their assumptions about each other were dangerously wrong. The first Dominion plasma bolts lit up the night sky over New York like deadly fireworks. High Chancellor Krex had ordered surgical strikes against Earth's major population centers, expecting the primitive humans to surrender immediately when faced with superior firepower. The energy beams carved through the atmosphere with devastating precision. Aimed at military command centers and government buildings, they struck hardened bunkers that had been empty for hours. Lieutenant Blake watched from her fighter cockpit as the alien attack hit prepositioned decoy targets filled with obsolete equipment and mannequins. Every major installation the Dominion targeted had been evacuated days ago, replaced with elaborate deceptions designed to waste their first strike. Meanwhile, the real command centers operated from hidden underground facilities that had been built specifically for this scenario. The Dominion pilots descended through Earth's atmosphere expecting to find a planet in shock and terror. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented in their centuries of conquest, an enemy that had been waiting for them. Earth's orbital defense platforms, disguised as research stations, suddenly revealed their true nature as massive weapon arrays powered up and targeted the alien fighters. Captain Torres engaged the first Dominion scout ship over the Pacific Ocean, his railgun spitting projectiles at relativistic speeds. The alien pilot tried to evade using standard evasive patterns that worked against energy weapons, but human kinetic projectiles followed different rules. The hypervelocity slug punched through the scout's shields and hull like they weren't even there. Turning sophisticated alien technology into expanding debris clouds, Engineer Patel worked frantically in the converted civilian shipyard, retrofitting cargo haulers and passenger ships with military-grade weapons. The Dominion had expected Earth's resistance to come from dedicated warships, but humanity was turning every vessel in orbit into a potential threat. Mining ships became missile platforms, construction vehicles became boarding craft and communication. Satellites became sensor networks, feeding targeting data to the improvised fleet. The Dominion's second wave encountered something their tactical computers couldn't process: chaos. Human defenders didn't follow military doctrine or predictable patterns. A garbage scow would suddenly reveal itself as a disguised weapons platform, launch a devastating volley, then disappear into the debris field around an industrial station. Construction mechs would use their tools to tear apart Dominion fighters in ways no military manual had ever described. High Chancellor Krex watched his carefully planned demonstration turn into a bloody mess as human ingenuity met Dominion overconfidence. His forces were taking casualties at rates that made no strategic sense. These primitives were using mining equipment as weapons, turning their own infrastructure into traps, and fighting with a level of desperate creativity that his military academy had never prepared him for. Commander Rivera coordinated the defense from Deep Station Alpha, the command center hidden in a hollowed-out asteroid. Her screens showed the battle developing across Earth's orbital space as human forces revealed capabilities the Dominion had never imagined. The secret defense programs had spent decades preparing for this moment, building weapons that looked primitive but incorporated principles learned from alien technology. The orbital railgun platforms opened fire in coordinated salvos, sending streams of hypervelocity projectiles toward the Dominion fleet. The aliens tried to intercept the incoming rounds with energy weapons, but human engineers had designed the projectiles to fragment into clouds of smaller penetrators just before impact. Dominion shields, configured to stop energy beams and missiles, proved vulnerable to swarms of high-speed metal fragments. Sergeant Miller led the ground defense of London as Dominion dropships attempted to land in Hyde Park, the aliens expected to face primitive human infantry with chemical weapons and kinetic firearms. Instead, they encountered defensive positions that had been prepared for decades, equipped with weapons that seemed crude but proved devastatingly effective against alien technology. The Dominion ground troops advanced in standard formation, their energy shields easily deflecting the first wave of human gunfire. Then Miller triggered the secondary systems, and the aliens discovered that human weapons were designed with multiple operating modes. The kinetic rounds switched to armor-piercing penetrators, the explosive charges became electromagnetic pulse generators, and the defensive positions revealed hidden surprises that turned the landing zone into a killing field. Dr. Walsh monitored the battle from his underground laboratory, analyzing every piece of data the human forces collected about Dominion technology. Each engagement provided new information about alien capabilities and limitations. The enemy shields were powerful but had specific frequency vulnerabilities. Their weapons were devastating but required significant charging time between shots. Most importantly, their tactical systems seemed designed for fighting conventional military forces. Not the improvised chaos of human resistance. The real breakthrough came when Colonel Hayes led a boarding action against a damaged Dominion cruiser. Human Marines, equipped with modified construction suits and improvised weapons, cut through the alien hull using industrial plasma torches. The Dominion crew had never faced boarding actions by species that treated spacecraft maintenance equipment as military hardware. Inside the alien ship, the humans discovered the Dominion's critical weakness. Their technology was incredibly advanced, but also incredibly specialized. Every system was designed for specific functions and couldn't be easily adapted for different uses. The aliens were masters of perfected engineering, but they had lost the ability to improvise that characterized human technology. the Dominion crew fought bravely, but they were trained to operate in controlled environments with predictable threats. Human boarding parties moved through their ship like a cross between commandos and repair crews, using whatever was available to overcome alien defenses. Maintenance tools became weapons, emergency systems became tactical advantages, and the humans' complete disregard for proper procedures became an insurmountable challenge for the orderly alien minds. High Chancellor Krex realized his demonstration had become a disaster. Instead of breaking human resistance, the first attack had revealed the extent of their preparations and capabilities. Worse, the battle was being broadcast throughout Dominion space, where vassal species were watching primitives successfully resist the empire that had dominated them for centuries. The tactical analysis was clear. Earth's defenders were using principles of warfare that the Dominion military had forgotten existed. They improvised constantly, adapted to changing conditions instantly, and treated every engagement as a creative problem to be solved rather than a predetermined scenario to be executed. The humans were turning the very primitiveness of their technology into an advantage, using simple and reliable systems in ways their sophisticated opponents couldn't predict or counter. As the first day of combat ended, both sides assessed their positions. The Dominion had failed to achieve their objectives and suffered casualties that made no strategic sense. The humans had proven they could fight, but they had also revealed the extent of their preparations and capabilities to an enemy. With overwhelming numerical superiority, High Chancellor Krex began planning a proper military campaign, instead of a simple demonstration. These humans would require conquest through sustained warfare rather than psychological intimidation. It would take longer than planned, but the eventual victory would be more satisfying and serve as a better example to other potential rebels. What the High Chancellor didn't realize was that humanity had been preparing for sustained warfare since the day they discovered they weren't alone in the universe. The first battle had been their opening move, not their desperate last stand. Earth's real defenses were just beginning to reveal themselves, and the Galactic Dominion was about to learn why humans had survived and thrived on a planet that actively tried to kill them for millions of years. The war had begun, and both sides were about to discover that their opponents were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. 3 months into the war, Dr. Morgan made a discovery that changed everything. The xenobiologist had been studying captured Dominion prisoners, trying to understand how their minds worked, when she realized the aliens' greatest strength was also their fatal weakness. They were perfect soldiers who followed orders without question, operated with mathematical precision, and never deviated from established protocols. They had no idea how to fight an enemy that treated war as an art form instead of a science. Colonel Hayes crawled through the ventilation system of the Dominion battleship, his team following behind him with a collection of improvised weapons that would have horrified any military academy instructor. They carried welding torches, industrial adhesives, maintenance robots reprogrammed as explosive devices, and a thermos full of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The aliens had sensors that could detect every known type of military equipment, but they had never programmed them to look for janitor supplies. The Dominion crew responded to the human intrusion exactly as their training dictated. They sealed compartments, activated security protocols, and deployed armed response teams to eliminate the threat. What they didn't expect was for the humans to ignore their own safety, bypass obvious routes, and use the ship's own systems against them in ways that violated every principle of spacecraft design. Hayes and his team had studied the captured ship schematics for weeks, not to understand how the systems were supposed to work, but to figure out how they could be made to work differently. They rerouted power conduits to create electromagnetic fields that disrupted alien equipment, used a life support system to spread a non-lethal but extremely irritating chemical compound throughout the ship, and turned the artificial gravity generators into weapons by making selected areas randomly switch between high and zero gravity. Sergeant Miller's urban warfare tactics had evolved into something that resembled performance art more than military strategy. His defenders had turned every major city into a maze of interconnected traps, decoys, and surprises that made conventional military occupation impossible. The Dominion ground forces could capture territory, but they couldn't hold it because the humans refused to follow the rules of defeat. When alien troops occupied a city district, the local population would appear to surrender completely, then begin a campaign of creative resistance that drove the occupiers to distraction. Street signs would be changed to point in random directions, public transportation would mysteriously route alien patrols to empty buildings, and the humans would use their intimate knowledge of urban infrastructure to appear and disappear like ghosts. The psychological warfare was even more effective than the physical resistance. Dominion soldiers were trained to expect either submission or open rebellion, not a population that treated occupation as an elaborate practical joke. Humans would follow alien orders with enthusiasm while somehow managing to accomplish nothing. Useful, ask endless questions that technically weren't violations of martial law, and demonstrate a talent for malicious compliance that turned every simple directive into a complex negotiation. Commander Rivera watched the strategic situation develop from Deep Station Alpha, analyzing reports that painted a picture of warfare unlike anything in recorded history. The Dominion was winning battles but losing the war because they couldn't understand the enemy they were fighting. Every victory created new problems. Every successful attack revealed unexpected human capabilities, and every occupied territory became a source of constant complications. The aliens had conquered 47 worlds. Using the same basic strategy: demonstrate superior technology, defeat organized resistance, then establish administrative control over a demoralized population. But humans had studied those previous conquests through intercepted Dominion communications, and they had developed countermeasures for every aspect of the standard occupation protocol. Captain Torres commanded a growing fleet of improvised warships that operated according to principles the Dominion couldn't grasp. Human vessels were built to be repaired in space using whatever materials were available, modified constantly to adapt to changing tactical situations, and operated by crews who treated regulations as suggestions rather than absolute rules. The aliens flew ships that were technological marvels, perfectly designed for their intended roles and maintained to exacting standards. When they were damaged, they required specific replacement parts manufactured in dedicated facilities. When they needed modifications, the changes had to be approved by engineering departments and implemented by trained specialists. The ships were superior to human vessels in every measurable way, but they couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. Human ships were technological disasters that somehow kept working. They were built from whatever materials were available, repaired with improvised solutions, and modified by crews who treated spacecraft maintenance as a creative challenge. They broke down constantly, operated inefficiently, and violated safety regulations that existed for good reasons. But they could be fixed anywhere, modified for unexpected situations, and operated by people who had learned to work with unreliable equipment. The difference became crucial during the Battle of Luna Station, when Dominion forces attempted to capture humanity's primary orbital facility. The alien fleet approached in perfect formation, their weapons charged and shields raised, expecting to overwhelm the station's defenses through superior firepower. Instead, they encountered a defensive network that seemed to operate according to chaos theory rather than military doctrine. Lieutenant Blake led a squadron of fighters that shouldn't have existed. They were built from spare parts, powered by jury-rigged engines, and armed with weapons that had been designed for completely different purposes. The Dominion pilots tried to engage them in conventional aerial combat, but the human fighters didn't follow conventional patterns. They used debris as cover, industrial equipment as weapons, and their own apparent incompetence as a tactical advantage. The alien pilots were trained to fight enemies who followed predictable behavior patterns. But human pilots treated every engagement as an opportunity to try something new. They would ram enemy ships with constructed debris, use mining charges as improvised missiles, and coordinate attacks through methods that seemed to rely more on intuition than communication. Engineer Patel had turned the industrial facilities around Luna Station into the most dangerous construction project in human history. What appeared to be routine maintenance and expansion work was actually the installation of a defensive system that used the station's own infrastructure as a weapon. The aliens saw a civilian facility with minimal military value, but Patel had turned every piece of equipment into a potential threat. When the Dominion forces moved to capture the station, they discovered that the docking bays were equipped with magnetic accelerators that could launch cargo containers at combat velocities. The construction cranes had been modified to operate as massive kinetic weapons, and the entire facility could reconfigure itself in ways that turned familiar spaces into deadly traps. Dr. Morgan realized that the key to human success wasn't technological superiority or military genius, but something the Dominion had eliminated from their own culture through centuries of perfected efficiency, the ability to fail creatively. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history dealing with systems that didn't work properly, environments that changed without warning, and problems that required improvised solutions. The Dominion had created a perfect military machine, but perfection had made them rigid. They could execute flawless strategies against predictable opponents, but they couldn't adapt when faced with an enemy that refused to be predictable. Every human failure created new possibilities, every setback became an opportunity to try something different, and every defeat taught lessons that could be applied to the next engagement. High Chancellor Krex studied the tactical reports with growing frustration. His forces were achieving their objectives but somehow losing ground. Human resistance was increasing instead of decreasing, their capabilities were expanding rather than diminishing. And worst of all, their apparent incompetence was proven more effective than the military precision the Dominion had perfected over centuries. The humans were doing everything wrong according to established military doctrine, but their mistakes were creating advantages that proper tactics couldn't counter. They were winning through failure, succeeding through incompetence, and turning their own limitations into weapons that the Dominion couldn't defend against. As the fourth month of the war began, High Chancellor Krex realized that conquering Earth would require more than military might. He was fighting an enemy that operated according to principles his civilization had forgotten, and winning would mean learning to think like the primitive species he had underestimated. The problem was that thinking like a human might be the most dangerous thing anyone in the Dominion could do. 6 months after the war began, humanity took its first step beyond Earth's solar system. Captain Webb commanded the expedition force that materialized in the Kepler system, where Dominion forces maintained a fortress world that had served as a regional command center for over a century. The aliens expected their next attack to come from Earth's defensive positions, not from the deep space routes they considered completely secure. The human fleet consisted of 12 ships that looked like they had been assembled in someone's garage, which wasn't far from the truth. Each vessel incorporated technology reverse-engineered from captured Dominion equipment, combined with human engineering principles that prioritized functionality over elegance. They were ugly, inefficient, and completely unlike anything the Dominion sensors were programmed to recognize as military threats. Webb's flagship had started life as a cargo hauler before being converted into a weapons platform that could accelerate projectiles to significant fractions of light speed. The conversion process had taken 3 months and violated approximately 200 safety regulations, but it could deliver kinetic strikes that would penetrate any known defensive system. More importantly, it could do so while looking like a civilian vessel conducting routine maintenance operations. The fortress world of Kepler 438b had never been attacked in its entire history. The Dominion had built it as an administrative center, surrounded by defensive installations that could repel any conceivable threat. The orbital platforms bristled with energy weapons. The surface installations housed thousands of troops, and the command center was protected by shields that could withstand direct hits from capital ship weapons. What the fortress couldn't withstand was an attack by enemies who ignored the concept of proper military targets. Human forces bypassed the defensive installations entirely, instead focusing on the infrastructure that kept the fortress operational. They targeted water treatment plants, power generation facilities, communication networks, and waste disposal systems with the methodical efficiency of extremely destructive janitors. The Dominion garrison responded according to standard protocols, deploying forces to protect military assets while maintaining defensive positions around strategic objectives. They couldn't understand why the humans were wasting ammunition on civilian infrastructure instead of engaging in proper combat. But they weren't particularly concerned about attacks that seemed designed to cause inconvenience rather than military damage. They began to understand when the fortress lost power, water, communications, and sewage treatment simultaneously. Major Stone's Special Operations Team had spent weeks infiltrating the fortress world, not to gather intelligence or sabotage military equipment, but to learn how the Dominion's daily life actually functioned. They discovered that the aliens had built a perfect civilization that depended completely on integrated systems working exactly as designed. When those systems stopped working, the entire society ground to a halt. The infiltration had been surprisingly easy because humans looked enough like several Dominion species to pass casual inspection, especially when wearing the sort of maintenance uniforms that everyone ignored. Stone's team had walked through the fortress posing as repair personnel, collecting information about vulnerabilities that the aliens didn't even realize they had. The psychological warfare began when the fortress personnel tried to restore their basic services and discovered that nothing worked the way it was supposed to. The water system pumped cleaning fluid instead of drinking water, the power grid delivered electricity in random surges that damaged sensitive equipment, and the communication network broadcast human music at volumes that made concentration impossible. Commander Rivera coordinated the operation from the human command ship, watching as Dominion forces tried to respond to an attack that targeted their assumptions about civilized warfare. The aliens were trained to fight military enemies, not opponents who treated infrastructure maintenance as a weapon of war. Their tactical manuals had no procedures for dealing with enemies who attacked waste treatment facilities instead of command centers. The real breakthrough came when human forces made contact with the fortress world's slave population. The Dominion had conquered 17 species to build their empire, and each of those species remembered what freedom had meant before the conquest. The sight of humans successfully attacking Dominion forces sparked something that the Empire had tried to eliminate: hope. Dr. Walsh analyzed the intelligence data streaming in from the operation, discovering that the Dominion's greatest weakness was their complete dependence on the loyalty of conquered peoples. The Empire had ruled for centuries through demonstrations of invincibility, but humanity's successful attacks were proving that the Dominion could be defeated by enemies who refused to play by their rules. The slave species had been waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. Human tactics didn't just defeat Dominion forces, they provided a template that other species could adapt to their own circumstances. The Empire had created a perfect system of control that depended on everyone believing it was perfect, and humans were systematically destroying that belief. Lieutenant Blake led bombing runs against Dominion supply convoys using fighters that shouldn't have been able to reach interstellar space. Human engineers had solved the faster-than-light travel problem by ignoring safety margins that existed for good reasons, building ships that could jump between star systems while having approximately the same life expectancy as mayflies. The attack runs were suicide missions by any reasonable standard, but humans had never been particularly reasonable. Blake's pilots treated the missions as extreme sports with military objectives, using techniques that violated every principle of safe spacecraft operation. They would jump into systems at random coordinates, attack whatever targets they could find, then jump out before the defenders could organize a response. The Dominion tried to counter these attacks by deploying patrol fleets along the most likely approach routes. But human ships didn't use likely approach routes. They would jump into the outer edges of star systems, use planets for gravitational assists, and appear in locations that proper navigation computers would never select. The aliens couldn't defend against attacks that came from directions their enemies shouldn't be able to survive. Engineer Patel had solved the logistics problem, through methods that would have horrified any military supply officer. Human forces didn't carry traditional supply lines because they didn't need traditional supplies. They could manufacture ammunition from asteroid materials, generate power from stellar radiation, and repair damaged equipment. Using salvaged components from whatever was available, the Dominion military depended on carefully maintained supply chains that delivered specific materials to predetermined locations at scheduled times. Human forces operated more like extremely violent nomads, taking whatever they needed from their environment and adapting their tactics to match available resources. They could fight indefinitely in locations where Dominion forces would starve. In weeks, Admiral Thane coordinated the expanding resistance movement from Earth, establishing communication networks that connected human forces with rebel groups throughout Dominion space. The aliens tried to jam these communications, but humans had designed their systems to use methods that the Dominion couldn't detect or interrupt without destroying their own infrastructure. The network operated through principles that the Empire's communication specialists couldn't understand. Instead of using dedicated channels and standardized protocols, human systems adapted constantly to changing conditions, used whatever frequencies were available, and routed messages through pathways that seemed to rely on chaos theory rather than network engineering. High Chancellor Krex realized that his empire was facing something unprecedented, a successful rebellion that was spreading faster than he could contain it. Human tactics weren't just defeating Dominion forces. They were teaching other species how to fight back using methods that the Empire couldn't counter without destroying the infrastructure that made their civilization possible, the fortress world of Kepler 438 be surrendered after 2 weeks of human occupation, not because it had been militarily defeated, but because its population could no longer function without basic services. The garrison troops remained combat effective. Their weapons still worked perfectly, and their defensive positions were still intact, but they couldn't fight enemies who had turned their own civilization against them. As human forces prepared to move to their next target, they left behind something more dangerous than military defeat: proof that the Galactic Dominion could be beaten by anyone willing to think differently about warfare. The conquered species had seen humans turn the Empire's perfection into vulnerability, and they were beginning to understand that their chains were weaker than they had believed. The hunters had become the hunted, and the prey was discovering it had teeth. 1 year after declaring war on Earth, High Chancellor Krex assembled the largest fleet in Dominion history for what he intended to be the final battle. The rebellion had spread to 37 worlds. His fortress systems were falling to enemies who fought like organized disasters, and worst of all, the conquered species were beginning to remember what courage meant. The only solution was to destroy humanity's homeworld so completely that hope itself would die with them, the armada that emerged from hyperspace. Above Earth was a sight that should have ended the war instantly. 200 capital ships, each one capable of sterilizing continents, supported by thousands of fighters and protected by shields that had never been penetrated. The fleet carried enough firepower to crack planets and enough troops to occupy entire star systems. It was the largest military force the Dominion had ever deployed, and it was aimed at a single world. President Harrison watched the alien fleet take position from the emergency command center buried 3 kilometers beneath the Colorado Mountains. The facility had been designed to survive nuclear wars, asteroid impacts, and alien invasions, though the planners had probably never expected to deal with all 3 possibilities simultaneously. Above ground, the world's population was evacuating to shelters that had been prepared for this moment since the war began. The evacuation was humanity's greatest logistical achievement, moving 8 billion people to underground facilities in less than 48 hours. But it wasn't a retreat. It was preparation for the kind of warfare that had made humans the most dangerous species in their corner of the galaxy. They were preparing to fight for their home with every weapon, every trick, and every dirty tactic they had learned in a year of proving that conventional military wisdom was just another limitation to be overcome. Captain Torres commanded Earth's defense fleet from the Bridge of the Resilience, a ship that embodied everything humans had learned about fighting alien technology. Built from captured Dominion materials using human engineering principles, it was fast enough to evade energy weapons, tough enough to survive direct hits, and ugly enough to offend artistic sensibilities across multiple star systems. The ship's crew represented every nation and background on Earth, united by the knowledge that they were fighting for the survival of their species. They had trained together, fought together, and learned to trust each other completely because there was no alternative. The Dominion fleet might have superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but the human defenders had something their enemies couldn't understand. They were protecting their home. The battle began when High Chancellor Krex ordered a demonstration. Bombardment, expecting the humans to surrender when faced with the full might of Dominion military power. Energy beams that could melt mountains struck Earth's surface, only to discover that the humans had learned to use their own planet as a defensive system. The bombardment triggered carefully placed charges that redirected the energy into underground conduits, turning the attacks into power sources for Earth's defensive systems. General Brooks coordinated the global defense from his command post, watching as human ingenuity met Dominion firepower in ways that violated every principle of space warfare. The aliens were trying to fight a conventional battle against opponents who had spent a year perfecting unconventional tactics. Earth's defenders didn't just fight back, they turned the battle itself into a weapon. The orbital defense platforms revealed their true nature as the Dominion fleet moved to attack positions. What the aliens had identified as research stations and communication arrays suddenly reconfigured themselves into massive weapons that operated on principles the invaders couldn't understand. The platforms didn't use energy weapons or missiles, they used kinetic projectiles, accelerated by magnetic fields that drew power from Earth's own magnetic field. Lieutenant Blake led the fighter defending ships that shouldn't have been able to compete with Dominion technology. Human fighters were built for speed and maneuverability rather than armor and firepower, piloted by crews who treated combat flying as a form of extreme athletics. They couldn't match alien weapons or shields, but they could go places and do things that proper military equipment wasn't designed to handle. The human fighters used Earth's atmosphere as a tactical advantage, diving into the upper atmosphere, where alien sensors couldn't track them effectively, then emerging at unexpected angles to attack vulnerable points on Dominion ships. They coordinated through methods that seemed to rely on intuition rather than communication. Moving like a flock of birds with weapons, Engineer Patel had turned Earth's entire orbital infrastructure into a defensive network that operated according to principles of controlled chaos. Satellites became kinetic weapons, space stations became fortresses, and even orbital debris became ammunition for weapons that used the planet's rotation to generate destructive force. The Dominion fleet found itself fighting not just human ships, but the entire solar system. The aliens tried to counter human tactics by deploying their most advanced weapons and defensive systems, but they discovered that fighting humans meant dealing with opponents who treated advanced technology as raw materials for improvised solutions. Every Dominion advantage became a vulnerability. When humans figured out how to turn it against them, Dr. Walsh coordinated the scientific warfare from his underground laboratory, analyzing Dominion technology in real time and developing countermeasures that could be implemented by field teams within hours. The humans had learned to reverse engineer alien equipment faster than the aliens could deploy it, turning each engagement into a learning experience that improved their capabilities. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Miller's ground teams captured a Dominion command ship that had been forced down by coordinated attacks from every direction simultaneously. The aliens inside had never experienced ground combat against humans, and they discovered that their training for civilized warfare was useless against opponents who treated the battlefield as a three-dimensional puzzle to be solved through creative violence. Human infantry moved through the alien ship like deadly maintenance crews, using tools and tactics that the Dominion had no defense against. They cut through bulkheads with industrial equipment, rerouted power systems to disable alien weapons, and used the ship's own life support systems to create tactical advantages that turned familiar spaces into alien landscapes. Commander Rivera realized that the battle for Earth had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a fight between two completely different philosophies of warfare. The Dominion fought to conquer, following established procedures and proven tactics. Humans fought to survive, using whatever worked and adapting constantly to changing circumstances. The difference became crucial when the Dominion fleet tried to land ground forces on Earth's surface. The aliens expected to face military resistance from organized units defending strategic positions. Instead, they encountered an entire planet that had been turned into a weapon, defended by a population that treated invasion as a personal insult requiring creative response. Every city had been prepared for urban warfare using techniques that combined military strategy with civil engineering. The aliens found themselves fighting not just human soldiers, but human civilians who had spent months learning how to turn their own neighborhoods into elaborate traps. The invasion force that was supposed to occupy Earth instead found itself trapped on a planet where every street corner was a potential ambush and every building was a possible fortress. Major Stone's special operations teams had infiltrated the Dominion fleet during the battle, using captured alien equipment and identification to move freely among enemy ships. The aliens had never imagined that primitive humans could successfully impersonate Dominion personnel, but human actors had been studying captured alien behavior patterns for months. The infiltration teams didn't try to sabotage alien technology because they knew the Dominion could repair or replace damaged equipment quickly. Instead, they focused on psychological warfare, spreading rumors and disinformation that exploited the aliens' rigid command structure. They convinced alien units that other units had been compromised, caused friendly fire incidents by providing false targeting information, and gradually turned the Dominion fleet's perfect coordination into paranoid chaos. High Chancellor Krex watched his overwhelming advantage dissolve into confusion as human tactics destroyed his fleet's ability to function as a coordinated force. The aliens were winning individual battles, but losing the war because they couldn't adapt to fighting enemies who refused to be predictable. Every victory created new problems. Every successful attack revealed unexpected human capabilities, and every hour of combat made the situation more chaotic. The final phase of the battle began when human forces revealed their ultimate weapon, Earth itself. The planet's rotation had been altered slightly using carefully placed gravitational manipulators, creating tidal effects that disrupted alien ship formations. The magnetic field had been modified to interfere with Dominion navigation systems. Even the atmosphere had been weaponized, seeded with particles that degraded alien sensor effectiveness while providing cover for human operations. Captain Torres led the final assault against the Dominion flagship, commanding a fleet of ships that had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt multiple times during the year-long war. The human vessels were technological disasters held together by ingenuity and determination, crewed by people who had learned to treat impossible odds as interesting challenges. The assault succeeded not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through something the Dominion couldn't counter: the complete inability to predict what humans would do next. The attack came from directions that shouldn't have been possible, using weapons that shouldn't have worked, coordinated through methods that violated every principle of military communication. High Chancellor Krex realized his defeat when human boarding parties reached his command bridge using maintenance tunnels that shouldn't have been accessible to hostile forces. The humans who captured him were exhausted, outnumbered, and equipped with improvised weapons that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts. They should have been easily defeated by Dominion security forces. Instead, they had won, because they fought like humans. The war ended not with a massive battle or dramatic confrontation, but with a simple realization that spread throughout the Dominion fleet: humanity couldn't be conquered, because they refused to accept the concept of inevitable defeat. Every setback became an opportunity, every limitation became a challenge, and every impossible situation became a chance to prove that humans could do the impossible. The Galactic Dominion sued for peace from a position that should have been overwhelming strength but had somehow become desperate weakness. High Chancellor Krex's perfect fleet had been defeated by opponents who treated warfare as an art form rather than a science, and who had turned their own apparent incompetence into the most devastating military advantage in galactic history. As the alien ships withdrew from Earth's solar system, they left behind something more significant than a defeated planet. They left behind proof that the Galactic Dominion could be beaten by anyone willing to think differently about power, warfare, and the nature of civilization itself. The message spread throughout Dominion space faster than the Empire could contain it. Humanity had not just survived the greatest military force in galactic history. They had defeated it using principles that any species could adopt: creativity, adaptability, and the absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Within months, the Galactic Dominion collapsed as world after world declared independence. Inspired by humanity's example and armed with human tactics adapted to their own circumstances, the empire that had ruled for centuries fell not to superior technology or military might, but to the simple idea that freedom was worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Earth became not just a survivor of alien invasion, but the catalyst for galactic liberation, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe is a species that doesn't know when to give up.